Behind these carefully guarded words lay serious alarm, not only with regard to the operations at the front, but as to the composition of the army. It had been raised under various laws, and its portions were subject to conflicting classifications. It was partly a group of state armies, partly single Confederate army. None of its members had enlisted for long terms. Many enlistments would expire early in 1862. The fears of the Confederate administration with regard to this matter, together with its alarm about the events at the front, were expressed by Davis in a frank message to the Southern Congress 3 days later. "I have hoped," he said, "for several days to receive official reports in relation to our discomfiture at Roanoke Island and the fall of Fort Donelson. They have not yet reached me. The hope is still entertained that our reported losses at Fort Donelson have been greatly exaggerated." He went on to condemn the policy of enlistments for short terms, against which, said he, "I have steadily contended," and he enlarged upon the danger that even patriotic men who intended to enlist might go home to put their affairs in order, and that this, at a critical moment, the army might be seriously reduced. The accompanying report of the Confederate Secretary of War showed a total in the army of 340,250 men. This was an inadequate force with which to meet the great host which were being organized against it in the North. To permit the slightest reduction of the army at that moment seemed to the Southern President suicidal. But Davis waited some time longer before proposing to the Confederate Congress the adoption of conscription. Meanwhile, the details of two great reverses, the loss of Roanoke Island and the loss of Fort Donelson, became generally known. Apprehension gathered strength. Newspapers began to discuss conscription as something inevitable. At last, on March 28, 1862, Davis sent a message to the Confederate Congress advising the conscription of all white males between the ages of 18 and 35. For this suggestion, Congress was ripe, and the first conscription act of the Confederacy was signed by the President on the 16th of April. The age of eligibility was fixed as Davis had advised. The term of service was to be 3 years. Everyone then in service was to be retained in service during 3 years from the date of his original enlistment. The statute may be thought of as a great victory on the part of the administration. It was the climax of a policy of centralization in the military establishment to which Davis had committed himself by the veto in January of a bill to authorize the Secretary of War to receive into the service of the Confederate States a regiment of volunteers for the protection of the frontier of Texas. This regiment was to be under the control of the governor of the state. In refusing to accept such troops, Davis laid down the main proposition upon which he stood as military executive to the end of the war, a proposition which immediately set debate raging. Unity and cooperation by the troops of all the states are indispensable to success, and I must view with regret this as well as all other indications of a purpose to divide the power of states by dividing the means to be employed in efforts to carry a separate operation. In these military measures of the early months of 1862, Davis's purpose became clear. He was bent upon instituting a strong government, able to push the war through, and careless of the niceties of constitutional law or the exact prerogatives of the states. His position was expressed in the course of the year by a Virginia newspaper. It will be time enough to distract the councils of the state about imaginary violations of constitutional law by the supreme government when our independence is achieved, established, and acknowledged. It will not be until then that the sovereignty of the states will be a reality. But there were many Southerners who could not accept this point of view. The Mercury was sharply critical of the veto of the Texas Regiment Bill. In the interval between the Texas veto and the passing of the Conscription Act, the State Convention of North Carolina demanded the return of North Carolina volunteers for the defense of their own state. No sooner was the Conscription Act passed than its constitutionality was attacked. As the Confederacy had no Supreme Court, the question came up before state courts. One after another, several state Supreme Courts pronounced the act constitutional, and in most of the states the constitutional issue was gradually allowed to lapse. Nevertheless, Davis had opened Pandora's box. The clash between state and Confederate authority had begun. An opposition party began to form. In this first stage of its definite existence, the opposition made an interesting attempt to control the cabinet. Secretary Benjamin, though greatly trusted by the President, seemed never to have been a popular minister. Congress attempted to load upon Benjamin the blame for Roanoke Island and Fort Donelson. In the House, a motion was introduced to the effect that Benjamin had not the confidence of the people of the Confederate States or of the Army, and that we must respectfully request his retirement from the office of Secretary of War. Friends of the administration tabled the motion. Davis extricated his friend by taking advantage of Hunter's retirement and promoting Benjamin to the State Department. A month later, a congressional committee appointed to investigate the affair of Roanoke Island exonerated the officer in command and laid the blame on his superiors, including the late Secretary of War.